Now, Amnon Aran, an academic of Middle Eastern Studies at City University, and Ghada Kami, who's a research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at Exeter University. Very nice of you both to come in. Let's start with those measures from Jeremy Corbyn to now. If he's accepted the need to make changes to the party, does it admit, if you like, the party has a problem with anti-Semitism? Ghada?
No, not necessarily. I think that the ferocity of the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn, on certain members of the Labour Party, accused of anti-Semitism and so on, has rattled the Labour leadership. I think that's what's happening.
You don't think there is anti-Semitism within the Labour Party?
There is anti-Semitism all over the place. I think that the issue...
So there is within the Labour Party. Is that a concession that there is?
There is, and as there is in the general population. But you see, I think the problem is people don't look into this properly. They haven't bothered to examine these accusations of anti-Semitism to see what actually those accused of this in fact said. And I think what people would find is that a lot of those comments were critical of Israel and Israel's policies, and that is not anti-Semitism.
Sure. I'm going to bring you in a second, but just let's stick on this for 1 second. Naz Shah was the MP at the centre of this, who suggested that Israel should be moved to the United States. Would you find that statement anti-Semitic?
Absolutely not. Look, everybody knows that Israel is very close to the United States, that the United States protects Israel, it funds it, it arms it. Everybody knows that.
Moving the whole state of Israel, all the people within it, to the United States would not be considered anti-Semitic in your mind?
Let me explain.
Sure.
But it is, if you like, a clumsy way of expressing precisely that comment, the fact that the two are very closely knit together. Okay. And let me just say very quickly, over 1 million Israelis live in the United States. Lots of Israeli citizens have dual
I want to bring Amnon in to see how he hears this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are 3 points, really. I think, first of all, there is a problem in the Labour Party, as acknowledged by the steps taken by Jeremy Corbyn. I think the statements made by Ken Livingstone and Naz Shah have been scrutinised quite carefully. And I also think that Ken Livingstone's past actions, especially, for example, the celebration of somebody like Yusuf Qaradawi, who actually praised Hitler and said, and I quote, that he put the Jews in their place, does strongly suggest that there is a deeply seated anti-Semitic element, unwittingly or not, within Kevin Livingstone. That's point number 1. Point number 2 about Naz Shah, I think if one concedes or condones the idea of transferring a whole population, then surely that should be applicable if one does. I certainly do not. But if Naz Shah would have said that or proposed that as a policy to solve peace processes generally or zones of conflict, we could have maybe discussed that. But I'm sure you, for example, would not have supported the proposal to transfer Palestinians to Jordan, even though 70% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian. I certainly would not support it. But the argument that there are 1 million Israelis in the US and therefore transportation of Israelis is somehow logical and not anti-Semitic seems to me like a fallacy.
Listen, I have to make this clear. Naz Shah did not say transporting the Israeli people to Israel, to the United States. She's saying Israel, the state of Israel, it's an idea that you should actually maybe... It's in the same vein as when you say to somebody, look, if you love them so much, why don't you go and live there? It's that sort of thing.
But just to get to the bottom of this, are you saying that the state of Israel should not exist?
No, I'll tell you what I am saying, though. I need to answer you on the question of transport. Listen, I am an expert on people being uprooted and transported elsewhere. I'm Palestinian.
I understand, and that's why I find
thousands of Palestinians were properly and really transported from our homeland, many of us into refugee camps.
I am aware of that.
So it is not an idea, it wasn't a little thing, a post on Facebook, it was a reality. I know all about that.
But it's precisely for that reason...
I don't put it in the same brackets.
No, but it's precisely for that reason why I can't understand how you can condone the comments that were made by Naz Shah. I personally, of course, would completely object any form of transfer of any population, Palestinian, Israeli, Jewish, or
let me widen this out a second. Do you have a problem with any other government policies in the region other than Israel's?
Of course. There are many Arab governments which are despotic, tyrannical, dictatorial. Of course.
But you would blame its people for that?
No.
Because the conflation is that when you talk about the state of Israel or moving the state of Israel, you're talking about all the people that exist in it. You're not talking about the policies of a party or a government.
No, this was, as I tried to explain, this was a kind of comment, but a lot
of people, forget Naz Shah for one moment, a lot of people are saying the state of Israel should not exist. You know that. When they say that, are they saying that is the whole state of it? They're not talking about Likud, they're not talking about Netanyahu, they're not talking about the government, they're talking about the Israeli people.
The Post, please don't let's go all over the place. The Post talked about moving Israel, the state of Israel, to the United States in a sort of a semi-jokey way. One must be able to say things, you know. No,
we're moving away from Naz Shah to a bigger question, which is the existence of the state of Israel.
And I think in that respect, I would just say that I think the real issue is the singling out of Israel in some of the debate. And I think if we are serious about being on the left and about being liberal, then surely we should apply our standards to many countries. Israel may be included in that, and I would certainly join the criticisms of many of the Israeli policies. The occupation is deplorable.
What about the fact that Israel, in a way, singles itself out? It has this policy, the right of return for all Jews. Do you think it is conflating there a people and a state by doing that?
Well, I think certainly Israel is predicated on the idea that it's a Jewish state. It has tried to be a Jewish and democratic state. I think there are various elements currently in Israel which impair and compromise its democratic credentials. And I dare say that there are many Israelis who point this out on a daily basis. So this is not something new. The only point that I would make in the context of the debate that we're having here is that often we find in the debate, I'll say here, in some elements in the British left, singling out of Israel on various issues which are to do with its human rights, violence, oppression, and so on and so forth. And I think if we're going to be serious about this, then this should be put in a broader context, not only of the region, by the way, but also further beyond. And then I think we can have a sensible debate about where actually Israel fits into that spectrum.
Right.
Do you actually think that anti-Semitism would disappear if Israel changed its borders?
No, look, there are two issues here, and they keep getting mixed up, and it's really not helpful. Israel as a state violates human rights, it's in breach of international law, it is therefore to be criticized, to be corrected, to be called
which
to account.
Which you do to a lot of other countries in the region, am I right, or not?
We're talking about Israel.
No, we're talking about where
Israel
fits into the context of the world in terms of criticism as well.
But Israel is among states in the world which violate human rights and which infringe international law.
Why haven't you mentioned any others then?
Well, but we're talking about anti-Semitism, the Labour Party, Israel. I mean, why do you want me to talk about China or Iran or whatever?
Because
we're
no other
talking about
state
Israel.
is questioned about its existence in that way.
No, we're not talking about the existence. I'm telling you.
I think you're not talking about the existence,
No.
but I think you're not, and I acknowledge that. But I think what we do find in the debates, in some of the debates, is that yes, Israel's right to exist is questioned, and I think the reason why we're trying to put this in a broader context is to see whether some element of the debate is fueled by anti-Semitism. Now, as I said before, when we have someone like Ken Livingstone who actually celebrates personalities such as Yusuf Qaradawi, and if we have somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, who at least has been affiliated for many years with groups who have profound anti-Semitic credentials, and I'm not by any way implying here that he himself is an anti-Semite, but what I am saying is that he is a fellow traveller, in the sense that I'll just finish this point, if his anti-Zionism brings him to share company with groups who are so viscerally anti-Semitic, and he does not acknowledge that, that is where I think that sense of denial comes from.
Do you accept that sometimes that anti-Zionism that he might acknowledge, would acknowledge, it covers, or if you like, that people use that, people call it racism or anti-Semitism when it isn't, that it stifles debate?
I think that certainly in some cases perfectly legitimate criticisms of the state of Israel are, there are attempts to stifle them on anti-Semitic grounds. However, I think that in this country, here in the UK, the debate on Israel, and certainly the criticism of Israel, is sufficiently vocal and conspicuous, which refutes any suggestion that somehow the debate or criticism in Israel is stifled in this country. I mean, that's the last thing that I think one could say.
Last word, very quickly, we've run out.
I'm afraid it is. I'm afraid this whole hoo-ha is about deflecting attention from what Israel is doing to other people, the Palestinians, and making people think about anti-Semitism rather than about the actions of the State of Israel. That's what this is about.
Thank you both very much.